The story you know might just be the tip of the iceberg. There are hidden messages from Jesus, coded and misinterpreted texts. Jesus' true message wasn't just about salvation, it was about something much deeper, a wisdom that could change your way of life and your connection with the Creator. In this video, we're going to dive deep into apocryphal texts, Gnostic Gospels, and little-known mystical traditions. But first, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Now, back in 2021, a team of archaeologists published evidence in the journal Scientific Reports that an airburst explosion devastated a Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley. For a few seconds, temperatures soared to over 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, vaporizing pottery and melting mud bricks. The site is Tall El Hammam in Jordan, just 8 miles from where ancient traditions placed the city of Sodom. This discovery reopened an investigation that had been cold for nearly 4,000 years. According to the book of Genesis, chapter 19, verse 24, "Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens." The biblical account describes a total, instantaneous destruction that came from above. Modern archaeological findings show exactly that, evidence of a sudden catastrophe that came from the sky. If this kind of historical detective work interests you, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making this content. The Valley of Siddim, where these cities thrived, is in the southern region of the modern-day Dead Sea. It's a depression situated 1,300 feet below sea level, surrounded by arid mountains and active tectonic faults. But 4,000 years ago, according to preserved records, this region was as fertile as a garden. Genesis 13:10 itself records that Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The prosperity of these cities didn't just come from agriculture. They controlled valuable deposits of bitumen and natural asphalt, materials essential for caulking ships and for embalming in Egypt. The first-century historian Josephus mentions these riches in his Antiquities of the Jews, describing how the asphalt lake, known today as the Dead Sea, still preserved signs of the ancient destruction. 5 cities formed this confederation: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela. The book of Genesis, chapter 14, lists these cities when they rebelled against a coalition of Mesopotamian kings. This places us chronologically around 2000 BC during the Middle Bronze Age, a period of major migrations and empire building in the region. It's interesting to see how the Bible presents the destruction not as an isolated event, but as the result of a process. The text suggests these cities had crossed a specific moral threshold, a point of no return. Before the destruction, there is an investigation. According to Genesis 18:21, the Lord declares, "I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." This is legal language, not emotional. It speaks of investigation, of evidence, of a process that culminates in a sentence. The account doesn't describe an angry God acting on impulse, but a form of justice operating according to specific criteria. The negotiation between Abraham and God, recorded in the same chapter, reveals that the destruction would be called off if at least 10 righteous people were found in the cities. 10 people, in urban centers that by the standards of the time must have housed thousands of inhabitants. The archaeological records at Tall El Hammam show a prosperous city that was suddenly abandoned for over 600 years after the destruction. The ash layers preserve evidence that the population simply vanished. There are no signs of war, siege, or famine. There is only the trace of an instantaneous catastrophe that reached temperatures capable of vaporizing organic material in seconds. Stephen Collins, the archaeologist who has led the excavations for over 15 years, found pottery fragments that were subjected to a thermal shock impossible to replicate with Bronze Age technology. The outer surface of the shards melted while the inside remained intact. This indicates exposure to an extreme heat source for a very brief period. Even more intriguing, nanodiamonds and metallic spherules were discovered in the destruction layers. These materials only form under extreme pressures, like those generated by cosmic impacts or nuclear explosions. In the Bronze Age, neither of those technologies existed. The Book of Genesis offers more details about the nature of the destruction. Chapter 19, verse 28, records that Abraham, watching from the region of Hebron, looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. Hebron is about 50 miles away. For smoke to be visible from that distance, the event had to be of colossal proportions. Maybe you see this detail differently. If so, let me know in the comments. The archaeological investigation also revealed something peculiar in the distribution of the debris. The evidence of destruction is concentrated in a specific direction, as if the destructive force came from a particular angle. This is consistent with an airburst, where the shockwave hits the ground in a cone, not uniformly. The biblical text preserves another important technical detail. Genesis 19:26 mentions that Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. For decades, commentators treated this as figurative language, but modern chemistry offers a plausible, literal explanation. The Dead Sea contains the highest concentration of salt on the planet. If an airburst vaporized masses of this hypersaline water, it would create a cloud of salt crystals and other minerals that would precipitate rapidly. Anyone exposed to this highly concentrated saline cloud would be instantly coated in a mineral crust. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, claimed to have seen pillars of salt in the region that the local inhabitants identified as remnants of the ancient destruction. He reports this in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 11, treating the information as a verifiable historical fact, not as a legend. But there's a question that the archaeological findings raise, which the ancient texts don't fully clarify. Why were these cities chosen for destruction? What exactly were they doing that crossed the line of divine tolerance? The preserved records suggest it wasn't just a matter of private immorality, but of a social structure that had institutionalized cruelty. The text of Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49, offers a surprising definition of Sodom's sin. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Arrogance, abundance, and idleness, producing a systematic indifference to the suffering of others. A prosperous society that had completely lost its capacity for empathy. If that caught your attention too, drop a comment below. The episode recorded in Genesis chapter 19, when the inhabitants of Sodom surround Lot's house demanding he hand over his guests, reveals the final stage of this moral degradation. It wasn't just uncontrolled sexual desire, it was the use of sexual violence as a weapon of humiliation against foreigners. A demonstration of power that turned the most intimate act into an instrument of terror. Lot's offer to give up his own daughters in place of his guests, as shocking as it seems to us today, followed an ancient code of hospitality that considered the protection of a visitor more sacred than one's own family life. But even that wasn't accepted. The mob specifically wanted the foreigners, and they wanted to humiliate them publicly. Apocryphal texts, like the Book of Jasher, preserved traditions about the wicked laws Sodom had instituted. According to these records, the city had criminalized helping the needy and turned cruelty into official policy. Visitors were systematically robbed, tortured, and killed. Hospitality, a fundamental value of all semi-nomadic cultures in the region, had been abolished by law. It is this institutionalization of cruelty that seems to have provoked the intervention recorded in the ancient texts. It wasn't about private behaviors, but about a social structure that had declared war on the very foundations of humanity. The excavations at Tall El Hammam have revealed a prosperous city that controlled important trade routes. Massive walls, a sophisticated water supply system, monumental architecture. It was a civilization that had reached a high level of technical and organizational development. But according to the preserved records, it had lost something essential: the ability to recognize moral limits. The destruction, when it came, was total and instantaneous. The archaeological evidence shows no escape, no resistance, and no attempt at immediate rebuilding. The population simply disappeared, and the site remained abandoned for centuries. The fire that rained from the sky, recorded in Genesis, left physical marks that modern science can analyze, but it also left a question that spans millennia. Is there a limit to divine tolerance for human injustice? And if there is, how do we recognize when a society is approaching it? The analysis of the ceramic fragments from Tall El Hammam revealed something that defies conventional explanations. Different materials were subjected to different temperatures at the same instant. Some shards melted completely, while others, found just a few feet away, remained intact. This suggests the heat source was not uniform, but selective in a way that modern physics cannot yet reproduce experimentally. This discovery raises fundamental questions about the nature of the event. If it was a cosmic impact, how can the irregular distribution of destruction be explained? If it was a volcanic phenomenon, why is there no evidence of magmatic activity in the region during that period? The scientific data confirms that something extraordinary happened, but it cannot define exactly what. The biblical account preserves details that seem like eyewitness testimony, but leave significant gaps. Genesis 19:15 records that the divine messengers hurried Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." The urgency suggests prior knowledge of an imminent event with a specific timetable. But how exactly did the messengers know the precise moment of destruction? And why did Lot hesitate so much that he had to be physically dragged out of the city? The text records in verse 16 that when he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters, and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. This hesitation from Lot is one of the most intriguing aspects of the story. A man described as righteous resists leaving a city that is about to be destroyed for its wickedness. The records don't fully explain this psychological contradiction. Was it a material attachment to his accumulated wealth? Or was there something about Sodom that exerted a deeper pull, even on someone who recognized its corruption? The presence of the men in the narrative also raises questions without definitive answers. Genesis chapter 18 initially describes them as 3 visitors whom Abraham receives. One of them speaks as if he were the Lord himself, while the other 2 proceed to Sodom as angels in Genesis chapter 19. But the text doesn't clarify whether they were temporary physical manifestations or beings with their own material substance. If this kind of historical detective work interests you, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making this content. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, had access to oral traditions and documents that have since been lost. In Antiquities of the Jews, he claims that traces of the destruction were still visible in his time, nearly 2,000 years after the event. He describes a land that remained barren and pillars of salt that the locals associated with Lot's wife. But Josephus also preserved an intriguing piece of information. According to him, the region continued to produce inexplicable phenomena. He mentions fruits that looked ripe, but would dissolve into ash when touched. He also reports that the lake could not sustain aquatic life, and that its vapors had adverse effects on those who lingered near it for too long. These descriptions suggest that the destruction left lasting consequences on the physical environment. The modern Dead Sea, with its extreme salinity and lack of life, may be a remnant of those events, but modern science cannot fully explain how an airburst, even a massive one, could produce permanent environmental changes. The question of Lot's wife remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of the account. Genesis 19:26 simply records that Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. The text doesn't explain whether it was the act of looking that caused the transformation, or if she was struck by the same destructive force for being outside the safe zone. The instruction was clear: flee for your lives, don't look back. But why would looking be lethal? If the destruction was coming from above, how could the fugitives themselves be hit just by turning their heads? Some ancient commentators suggested the prohibition was psychological, not physical, a way to prevent Lot's family from being overcome by the same attachment to the city that almost prevented their escape. Other ancient records preserve traditions that do not appear in the canonical biblical text. The Book of Jasher, cited in other biblical books as a historical source, contains details about the wicked laws Sodom had instituted. According to this text, the city had specifically criminalized charity and made cruelty a civic duty. One such law allegedly stated that anyone who offered food to a person in need would be burned alive. Another decreed that visitors were to be systematically robbed through a corrupt judicial process. The Book of Jasher even preserves the name of a young woman from Sodom who was executed for giving bread to a poor man, and whose blood was said to have cried out to heaven, prompting the divine investigation. If you've noticed this before, let me know in the comments. These traditions, though not canonized, offer an explanation for something the biblical text only hints at: how a prosperous society reached a point where it didn't even have 10 righteous people. It wasn't just a gradual moral decay, but the deliberate creation of legal structures that punished kindness and rewarded wickedness. Modern archaeology has found evidence that Tall el-Hammam controlled important trade routes and maintained relationships with distant civilizations. Egyptian artifacts, Mesopotamian pottery, and objects indicating regular trade with various cultures have been discovered. It was a cosmopolitan city, not an isolated village. This makes its total destruction even more significant. This wasn't a primitive village being punished for ignorance, but a sophisticated urban center that had deliberately chosen to institutionalize injustice. Wealth and knowledge, instead of producing wisdom, had generated systematic arrogance. The geographical location also raises questions. The Valley of Siddim was at a crossroads between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the highlands of Canaan. Whoever controlled this region influenced trade throughout the entire Fertile Crescent. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't just affect their local populations. It completely reorganized the balance of power in the region. Was this destruction merely a moral judgment, or was it also a geopolitical intervention? The ancient records don't offer a clear answer. The biblical text focuses on the ethical dimension, but the strategic consequences were enormous. The chronology also presents challenges. The events are set during the life of Abraham, around 2000 BC, but the archaeological evidence at Tall el-Hammam indicates destruction in different periods. Some layers show gradual abandonment, others sudden destruction. It's possible the site was inhabited and destroyed multiple times over the centuries. This raises the possibility that the destruction of Sodom, preserved in collective memory, is a synthesis of multiple destructive events in the same region. not necessarily a falsification of tradition, but the way oral cultures preserve memories of repeated collective traumas. The silence of the records on the fate of the other three cities in the Confederation is also notable. Adma, Zeboyim, and Bela are mentioned briefly, but there are no details about their destruction or preservation. Archaeologically, the southern region of the Dead Sea remains largely unexplored due to difficult access and extreme environmental conditions. The fundamental question remains: is there a correspondence between the moral judgment described in the ancient texts and the physical events documented by archaeology? Or are we dealing with two independent narratives that converge only by geographical coincidence? The answer has implications that go beyond historical curiosity. If the biblical records preserve an accurate memory of a real event, it suggests that the structure of the universe responds in some way to the moral condition of civilizations. If they are merely allegories built upon natural disasters, that doesn't diminish their value as a warning about the dangers of institutionalized injustice. Perhaps the most important question isn't whether Sodom and Gomorrah existed exactly as described, but whether the conditions that supposedly caused their destruction can be recognized in other times and places. The combination of material prosperity with systematic indifference to the suffering of others, the use of violence as an instrument of humiliation, the criminalization of mercy, these patterns have been repeated throughout history. Scientific investigation may clarify the physical mechanisms of the ancient destruction, but the preserved records suggest that the real mystery is not how these cities were destroyed, but why a prosperous civilization would choose to turn cruelty into a system of government, and whether that choice, taken to its ultimate conclusion, triggers self-destruct mechanisms that operate on both a moral and a physical plane. The smoke that Abraham saw rising like that from a furnace dissipated 4,000 years ago, but the questions this event raises about the limits of cosmic tolerance for human injustice remain suspended over every generation that faces the same fundamental choice between mercy and cruelty.